Hey, so most of you know that before I started working with veterans, I taught and wrote history. And while I don't teach anymore and still do just a little bit of writing, I do give history lectures around, or I used to before they all got suspended. And recently I ran across a piece of trivia that I thought you might be interested in. And that is, which American president was not a native English speaker. They learned English as a second language. What U.S. president grew up not speaking English, speaking another language, and had to learn English in school? I'll give you a moment to think about that. I'll give you a hint. It's a 19th century president. It's a president whose name you can tell by the name that doesn't conform with the Anglo names of the other 19th century presidents. So it's a slightly different name. And if you haven't gotten by it now, then I'm going to tell you Martin van Buren. Martin van Buren grew up speaking Dutch in a Dutch-speaking household and learned English only as a second language. And so he's our first and only non-native English-speaking president. Now, you can imagine that was used against him, and it was in the election of 1840 when Whig candidate William Henry Harrison, who was kind of a non-entity, not a famous guy, but he was very media savvy, used it to portray President Van Buren as a kind of out of touch, luxury-loving kind of aristocrat, and he pitched himself as the kind of common man candidate. Log cabin and hard cider campaign is what it was called. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. His running mate was John Tyler, even though William Henry Harrison was actually, and John Tyler, they were both Virginia aristocrats. But it was a very effective campaign. Used it against Van Buren and won. There was an 82%. It was really the first modern presidential campaign in a sense that it had mass turnout. I mean, 82%, I think, of the eligible voters in 1840 actually voted. A very popular election. And then William Henry Harrison himself became the answer to a trivia quiz, and that is what president served the shortest time in office? And of course, the answer is Harrison. He gave his inaugural address, an excruciatingly boring one and long one, by the way, inaugural address in March 1841, and then 30 days later he died. And I think the official cause of death was pneumonia, but I also think that contemporary physicians, if they look at the case record today, they would say, nah, he probably had a waterborne disease like cholera. And that would make sense because Washington, D.C. at that time didn't have a sewage system. It had a septic pond that was about 500 yards uphill from the White House, and no doubt it leached into the groundwater around the White House and into the White House well. Everybody who moved into the White House got sick. Most of them recovered. But he did not, and probably the reason he did not is because he got treated by doctors. One way to get yourself killed quickly in the 19th century was to be treated by medical professionals. Having a medical license in the 19th century was kind of a license to kill, and so they treated him with leeches and mercury and lead and something called snake root, I think, and actual snakes, I think. And they ended up killing poor William Henry Harrison after 30 days. And so his vice president, John Tyler, became president. And John Tyler is also the answer, or he's involved with a trivia question. And that is, John Tyler, get this, born in 1790, took office in 1841. He has 2 living grandchildren. Think about that. John Tyler had 13 kids, maybe. His last child was born, Lion Tyler, when he was in his 60s. Lion Tyler lived to be very old, lived to have 15 kids maybe. His last kid was born, I believe, when Lion Tyler was 75 years old. And so those 2 children are alive today. I think they're in their 90s. And their grandfather was President John Tyler, who was born in 1790. So all this brings me to our subject today, which is the subject of veterans benefits and the history of veterans benefits. Actually, it's a little kind of a trivia story involving veterans benefits. Veterans benefits is a subject that comes up at our events because veterans have, for decades and decades, been entitled to a raft of differing kind of benefits, usually around housing and health care and education, and occasionally around pensions. And actually, there's one person today, Irene Triplett. She is the only person alive, the only American who is still receiving a, a veteran's benefit based on service in the Civil War. Quite remarkable. She's 89 years old. She lives in a nursing home in North Carolina. Her father was a Civil War veteran, and her father received a veteran's pension. Her father was Mose Triplett, and I want to talk about the pension that he got. But first, you might be surprised to know that it really was the Civil War that introduced the veteran as a special class of citizen. Before the Civil War, there really was no distinction between those who had served in the armed service and those who were ordinary male citizens, because every male citizen was expected to be, in a sense, a veteran or somebody who served in the military. Militias were every adult male was enrolled in the local militia, and although this country was involved in a great number of wars and before the Civil War, and even some big ones, there were no such things as veterans benefits. There was no such things as veterans memorials. There were no veteran cemeteries. Veterans. There were no special awards or distinctions given to those who had served in war. Veterans weren't considered a distinct kind of class of citizen or a distinct subgroup of the population. It was really the Civil War that changed all that, and it was the Civil War that introduced the first federal commitment to take care of widows of those who had been killed in battle, and orphan children or dependent children of those who had been wounded. So the federal government committed itself for the first time ever to caring for those who had been disabled by the war, and those who had been left without their husbands because of the war. And that was a first. That was before that, federal government never provided any kind of benefit like that for veterans at all. And then in 1890, Congress passed a special act, the Dependent Pension Act, and it entitled anybody who had fought on the Union side during the Civil War to a pension. And by 1905, 25% of the U.S. adult male population over the age of 62 was receiving one of these pensions. It was considered extremely generous. It was about $1 a day, $360 a year, and it was about almost half of the federal budget was to pay for this extraordinarily generous at the time veterans pension. It was an old age program. It was a precursor to Social Security. And $1 a day was a lot of money in the 1890s and early 1900s. So if you had one of these pensions, you were a good catch. You were an eligible, and you were a bachelor. You were a very eligible bachelor. And that's what Mose Triplett was in 1924. He was a 78-year-old eligible bachelor, and he was getting one of these pensions based on his service for the Union. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War in 1862, he was on the other side. He was from western North Carolina, and he joined the Confederate Army, and he was a member of the 53rd North Carolina Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He would get sick or wounded, maybe both at different times, and he would end up in a hospital, and he would end up then being reassigned to another unit or joining another unit, the 26th North Carolina Infantry. And the 26th Infantry eventually made its way to Gettysburg and fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, and including Pickett's Charge, and was absolutely virtually wiped out. I mean, out of say 800 men or so who were in the 26th North Carolina Infantry Regiment, 700 plus were killed or wounded or taken prisoner. So it was lucky for old Mose Triplett that he deserted. He deserted before the 26th Regiment went to Gettysburg. He might have deserted straight from the hospital. He deserted and ended up joining a band called Kirk's Raiders that what they would do is raid the countryside, and it was a bunch of Union sympathizers in North Carolina. They would raid the countryside and raid from Confederate households and hand over everything that they captured, the contraband that they captured, they would hand it over to other Union sympathizers. So it was on the basis of that service that he started, I think in the summer of 1864, that he later applied for that pension when it was offered in 1890. And he was married, he had children, a family, his wife died, and age 78, he's a widower, and I guess looking for somebody to maybe cook and clean, and I guess have children for him. In the year 1924, he ended up marrying a woman who was 50 years his junior. She was 28 years old. He was 78 years old. They got married. In 1930, they had a baby, and that baby was Irene Triplett. And I believe Irene was born disabled, and so when old Mose finally died in 1938, his widow and Irene inherited the pension, which was $73.13 a month. $73.13 a month. She still gets that today. She still gets it today at age 89, living in a nursing home in North Carolina. Old Mose was quite the character. He was kind of an ornery character. I think he had a reputation for, starting a lot of fights. He was the kind of guy who, living in western North Carolina, who, would chase people who came near his property off with a shotgun. That kind of character. But it's Irene Triplett who inherited her $73.13 a month Civil War pension, and she's the last person receiving a veteran's benefit from the Civil War. So I thought I'd give you that little piece of trivia, and I think we'll talk more about veterans benefits, maybe veterans records also, at a later one of these videos. So I hope you all stay well, and if you like hearing some veteran stories and some history, please do follow or subscribe to the Veterans Breakfast Club on your favorite social media, and I look forward to seeing you soon.